Hello, everyone, and welcome to this NUS EMBAC Masterclass. I'm Professor Emily David from the Management Department here at NUS, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about the evolution of leadership over the course of the last several decades. When we think about leadership, at the start of the last century, leadership was one thing only. It was very much about one sole voice at the top of an organization that was very hierarchical. This voice was the one that made very specific tasks for everyone down in the hierarchy, and everyone knew what to do. They didn't question it, they didn't try and give input, and in return, they had very solid life employment, and they can enjoy a lot of different progression over the course of their career. Thanks to a lot of global trends, including globalization, technology advancements, and changing leadership styles and employee expectations, we find that the leader and follower dynamic is a little bit different from what we saw traditionally. So, in this talk, basically, we'll start with a little bit of a historical refresher for those of you who might not be familiar with the science of leadership. And then we'll go through some of the trends that are happening right now that have impacted and are continuing to impact the way that we lead our employees in organizations. Following that, I'll end you with four different strategies that you can do to try and future proof your leadership for the decades to come. Let's get started. When we think about leadership traditionally, a lot of people think of this traditional strongman tribal leader, right? This goes evolutionary back to our roots as tribal people, as people who had to stick together in order to survive all of the different threats that we had in our environment. But now, this kind of leadership isn't really exactly what we need. Why? Because this type of leadership and very, very strong, strict hierarchies are things that help us to be more efficient. They help us to have uniform outputs, and they help us in times of warfare. But hopefully, we have a lot of years of peace ahead of us. And in the times of heightened technology and a constantly changing world, as we'll discuss in a second, this kind of top down approach is no longer exactly the case. Traditionally, even in the times of organizations, we found that we had the person with the most expertise, the person with the most tenure, was the one that we looked to for guidance and leadership because they had seen every single kind of situation that could happen in our industry or in our organization. So they tended to have the answers that we were looking for whenever we were approached or kind of confronted by a new problem. But nowadays, things are changing so fast that this expertise isn't as valuable as it once was, right? We can no longer account that one person has all of the expertise, has all of the knowledge that we need whenever the technology itself is changing from month to month in a lot of cases that we see today. Right? So we need much flatter hierarchies. We need much more communication because we need people who are closer to the actual customers, closer to the technology itself, informing the processes and informing the decisions that we make. But this isn't exactly new, right? So if we look back into our history, into the earliest times of leadership theory and research, we could see that there's some common elements that are emerging once again today. Right, so if we look back to the start of last century, right, the early 1900s, we had a scientist. Actually, he started as a mechanical engineer, and his name was Frederick Taylor. All right, so Frederick Taylor was one of the pioneers of something that he called the scientific management process. Right, so he said it's not enough for leaders to be going by their guts when they're making these decisions and structuring work. So his methodology involved going to the site, observing people doing the work, taking out timers and kind of going through and asking people about these, informal knowledge that they had. And before redesigning it to be something that had, again, very little wasted motions, and it was getting things done faster and more efficiently than ever before. People who were also on this train were people like the Gilbreths. This was actually a married couple named Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, and according to the same principles of scientific management as they did in their research and as they brought to the workplace. They pioneered the method by using what was really top technology at the time, which was this kind of hand cranked video camera that they did to observe the jobs that they were trying to study. So he saw that basically people had three modes. They had the normal mode of bricklaying, where you had to reach down every hour 125 times to grab a new brick and another 125 times to grab some mortar to be able to put it onto the wall. But basically, after observing and kind of documenting the motions that were required to lay bricks, they said, you know what, we can have a lot more efficient way of doing this if we bring the bricks and mortar up on scaffolding so that the people that are doing this work no longer have to bend over multiple times to be able to grab them. Right, so just by eliminating this one motion, they were able to lay over double the amount of bricks in an hour, and the efficiency was greatly increased. Right, so there was a lot of advancement of having this kind of scientific approach to work. But as you can imagine, if you're trying to imagine yourself as the bricklayer or as someone who has had their job redesigned by this process, there were also a lot of ethical implications that kind of emerged from this process. Even though the workers were kind of doubling what their output was, they weren't seeing anything extra. And on top of that, not only were their rewards staying the same, but also their jobs got a lot more boring. We see that this kind of scientific approach, a lot of the pushback was that it takes the humanity out of work itself. It makes jobs more boring. People become more siloed, and actually there was a lot of pushback to these kinds of studies. And the workers themselves would actually try and game the system and work purposely slow so that they didn't have these increases in expectations for how much they were supposed to put out. So if you think about this, it should be starting to sound very, very familiar in today's world of algorithms and automation and the, machine learning that's controlling the pace of our work. And I think that there's some really real lessons that we can learn from looking back at this early work. And these lessons were noted back in the day as well. So, right around the same time that we had the scientific method going on, we had people who were opposed to this. So, one really visionary thinker at the time, her name was Mary Parker Foley, and she was, a really big critic of this approach because she said, you know what, you're taking the human out of the job. And moreover, you're treating them as machines themselves because people who would go in to study the jobs and the job processes often just use their camera or use their observation to try and figure out how they can optimize the work. But they never actually asked the people doing the work themselves what they thought could be improved or if they had any ideas about how to do the work in a better way. And according to Mary, this was the number one step that workers should be taking. And in fact, if they were the ones doing the work, that they should be the ones making the decisions, not someone in a corner office that's very separate from the work itself. All right, so she was a real visionary before her time. She really advocated things that we see in practice nowadays, things like cross-functional teams, self-managed teams, right? So having the empowerment of the employees to make decisions about their work if they're the ones that are doing it. Perhaps not surprisingly, though, not a lot of people paid attention to her at that time. And people still said, you know what, the best way to go is to try and find the most efficient way of doing this work. We need to keep on going with the scientific management approach. And there was another interesting round of kind of experiments that were happening that tried to apply this idea of scientific management in the factory setting. So at the Hawthorne factories, what happened is they wanted to see the impact of different lighting conditions on productivity for the factory workers. So they had a lot of different experiments where they tried to show different lighting levels and to see which one was the optimum one that would get people working the hardest. But they found a really peculiar finding at the end of this, and they saw that no matter how high or how low they put the lights, the workers in every condition produced more and more and more. So they studied other factors besides lighting, so things like break times and break duration on productivity. And again, they found that in every condition that they tried, productivity continued to go up. And so eventually, what they figured out is that it was the mere presence of the researchers themselves that actually caused the workers to kind of be more motivated and to produce a little bit more, right? They were happy that someone was finally paying attention to them, that they were actually interested in the work that they were doing and the outputs that they were doing. And that pride and that motivation was actually driving the productivity increases and not any of these arbitrary environmental things like the lighting or the breaks. All right, so this became known as the Hawthorne effect, and this combined with some of the ideas of Follet and her colleagues really was the cornerstone of the human relations movement and decades of organizational behavior research that followed after that. So all of the ideas that we've been talking about for a long time in terms of how we can design jobs to be more varied, more motivating, more challenging, the way that people really are motivated to try and do work harder outside of these different environmental conditions and incentives. All right, so we know this for a very long time that it's not, humans are not 100% rational, right? It's not about becoming the most efficient, productive version of yourself. Humans also want other things out of their work, right? They want things that are interesting. They want things that are varied. They want things that can give them a sense of belonging or showcase their skill sets. They want to grow in their competencies and they want to feel like they're contributing to something bigger and a higher cause or a higher purpose than just moving one widget from one place to another. Right? These are the things that psychologically really get people motivated and productive. And I think it's really important that we don't forget that in this age of automation and in age of AI and all this flux that's happening in the workplace. Because there seems to be, if you look at some of the modern examples of Amazon and all these other workplaces, there's a little bit of neo-Taylorism going on where, again, we're worshiping at the altar of efficiency and we're looking at how we can just get people to go as efficiently and with as low variation as possible, but that's not really how humans work. So I think that there's some valuable lessons here, and that if we continue going down this path, we might find that we see some of the same outputs that were happening in this era. History is important. As they always say, if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it, right? And so it's important to start with some of these lessons because it's something that it seems like a new thing, but it's something that we've dealt with once before. And we know that this leadership journey is getting increasingly more volatile, right? So we talk a lot about VUCA, about how things are changing faster than ever before, how we have more uncertainty. And on top of all of this, right, change and flux, we also see that it's not just linear change that we're dealing with, but it's actually disruptive change, right? So this idea that things happen overnight, as we've seen with the COVID pandemic and that we're seeing now with AI, and it fundamentally changes the way that we do work, whether that's the places that we're doing work or the medium and the technology that we're using, or which aspects of the work are getting done by the technology, by the tools, and which aspects are being delegated back to humans. But we see a lot of different changes that are happening, things like globalization, and then now we see this kind of ebb and flow between it in terms of the world getting more and more connected, but at the same time, more and more ethnocentrism that's rising up in a lot of different areas around the world. So we're always kind of dealing with these dueling realities, and it's becoming more and more difficult to be a leader, particularly of multinationals or global organizations. We see a lot of other trends. Technology, of course, is the one we talk the most about. But one that's really kind of relevant and kind of at the top of the news cycle are these changing ideas about diversity and equity and integration or inclusion initiatives, right? So different definitions of what this means, different attitudes about it in different areas. And so all of these things are always changing in terms of the priorities that we should have and the policies that we should implement. Right. At the same time, we're dealing with technology on a daily basis or a social basis that changes a lot of different aspects of the way we experience the world. Even things like news, which used to be, objectively one news that got reported to everyone, now we have increasingly personalized news cycles. So this becomes kind of an echo chamber where we're only exposed to the same kinds of ideas that we already believe in, right? We're only exposed to the opinions of other people who tend to agree with us, making people more and more siloed, as we saw in our history lesson just a moment ago. All right, so there's a lot of very serious challenges that are happening, and at the same time, we see that we have more data points, more digital data points, and analytics that we can also use in our day-to-day lives when we're trying to deal with our people and our leadership. All right, so really, all of these changes do call, in some ways, for a new type of leadership, or at least new priorities for leadership. But as I'll argue several times over the course of this talk, I think that the fundamentals of leadership, particularly in the strategy or the ethos of human related leadership and empathy, these things have not changed. And in fact, I think that they're more important than ever. Right. So now we hear a lot about this idea that interpersonal dynamics are dead. Eventually, we're just going to be leaders that are managing a bunch of machines or AIs to do the work. And then it takes out all of this fluff or all of this unpredictability that we have whenever we're dealing with human beings. But I don't see that as being the case at all. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. But basically, I think that there are always going to be things that the technology excels at, and there's always going to be things that humans excel at. We're not getting rid of humanity in the workplace. And these kind of challenges, right? These realities that we're dealing with now make it all the more crucial that we have these kind of empathy competencies, that we're able to deal with change, deal with human emotions and fears in a better way because they are more heightened than ever before. So I think these social competencies and these traditional human centered leadership competencies are things that we should focus more on, not less. Nowadays, we accept change as a constant, right? And so we need people who are constantly adapting and helping other people to accept these changes and understand why they're happening and understand why they're necessary. So we need people, our leaders in particular, to be good change managers, to help communicate why these changes are necessary and what it means for each one of us as stakeholders. We no longer need tight controlling or micromanagement. This is kind of one of the fears I have when I see a lot of the modern kinds of ways of leadership or management, so to speak, where we have things like keystroke monitoring, or we have, eye tracking the movements, or we have these cameras everywhere, all these other forms of technology assisted monitoring that, in essence, are just other ways of controlling people. This is not what we need. What we need for our humans is more autonomy, more environments where they can use this excess time to follow their creative pursuits. And so, in this way, we need our leaders to be facilitators, to be giving these kind of environmental and kind of climate based resources that we need in order to facilitate this kind of creativity and innovation. We no longer need people who are competitors all of the time, but instead foster things like cohesion and belonging. We saw in the pandemic, this was one of the big crises that we faced, is that once we were all working from home and separated from our coworkers, we had this kind of crisis of belonging, right? Humans are social animals, and we had to find new ways of relating to each other and coming together in meetings. People still want to have some sense of belonging, particularly if they're spending more and more of their time dealing with computers, dealing with algorithms, and not dealing with other humans. So, our leaders need to be there to foster and to facilitate some of these social activities back into the workplace. We also need people and leaders in particular who value different perspectives, right? Who can look at the same situation, who can look at the same problem from a lot of different angles. And to do this, we need to have exposure to people who naturally think in different ways. So we need people who value these different points of view and diversity. And finally, there's no one person who knows anything anymore, right? There's no one person who's going to come in and save the day. Instead, we need someone who's humble, who's a great listener. Listening is one of the most underrated leadership qualities that we have. And we need someone who is out there asking the right questions and gathering these unique pieces of information so that you can make the most informed decision that you can. Right? So it's no longer about knowing everything, it's about knowing where to get that information. Right? And so we see that this is what we need, but it's not necessarily what we're seeing is happening. All right, so this is a recent survey done by DDI, and we find that there's a trust crisis happening with our current leaders. Even though we need our leaders to be better and to have different competencies and to deal with all these challenges that we have in the workplace, we see that our leaders currently are just not up to par, right? We don't have that trust in them. We don't believe that they have our best interests at heart. Right, so there's still quite a big gap. There's still a lot of work for us to do as leaders in order to regain that trust and in order to do the things that our employees kind of expect us to do. All right, and so what do we need to do, or what is this competency that we need in the modern era of work? One of the ways of looking at this is something called integrative complexity, and essentially what this means is being okay with paradox, having the true belief that two completely opposing points of view can both be equally valid. Right. And this is something that's very difficult because it goes against our nature. It goes against the way that our brains are formed as human beings. We tend to be socialized over the course of our lives, and even the way that our brains work is in terms of heuristics. There's right and there's wrong, right? There's good and there's bad. We have to look at all the data and then decide one way or another. This is kind of the way that we're used to going around things, but in such a complex world, we really need to be able to sit with these contradictions and understand both the big picture and the granular details, the short and the long term, and try and look at the same issue from multiple points of view, and not only see it from all these angles, but try and draw bridges or draw connections between these different perspectives, so that way we can find a third path that might not exist yet. Right? So, in an ever changing world, it's not about knowing the right way to go. It's about looking at it from different points of view. If this was my priority, or if this was my way of looking at the world, how would I see this situation? As an opportunity or as a threat? But what about if I had employees first? What about if I saw myself as the figurehead? Right? So, putting yourself in all these different shoes, all these different ways of looking at the world and looking at problems can help you start to see things in a more well rounded way, but more importantly, start to draw some of these parallels and connections that help you live with that paradox and help you try and forge new ways of going forward. All right, so this idea of reflection, this idea of perspective taking, and this idea of truly asking the right questions and listening are skills that are going to just grow in importance for our leaders. All right, so at this juncture, we've kind of revisited our history, right, to see what lessons can be gleaned from the past for our future reality. We've also talked about some of the current challenges that leaders are facing, even as things change on a day to day basis. And now I want to leave you with four key suggestions or strategies, of how you can respond to some of what I think are the biggest trends that we see going forward for leaders. And these are basically learning how to lead across differences, right? So having a way to manage across people who happen to be different in different ways. This happens to involve personalizing work to accommodate these differences, but also to help motivate people and engage them in this crisis that we currently have of disengaged employees. You have to, of course, sharpen your AI acumen, and we'll talk about some strategies for leadership in the world of AI. And then finally, I think the key to all this is keeping humanity in the workforce, in your leadership style, and emphasizing and rewarding people for being human. Right, which sounds obvious, but I think that more and more, whenever I talk with leaders, it's something that's getting put on the wayside in all this frenzy and all this excitement about some of the technological advances that are happening in the world. All right, so let's take each one of these in turn. All right, so first of all, we're dealing and through the use of technology, it's very easy for us to have conversations with people all around the world. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, people are bringing more of themselves to the workplace than they ever have before. So, as leaders, we have to get adept at managing across differences and trying to put in that extra work of how can we have in all these interpersonal conversations with people who don't share our background or maybe have different demographic variables than the ones that we have. We know from research that there isn't a straightforward good or bad outcome associated with diverse teams. In some ways, they help us to be more creative, to have better performance, to reach different kind of customer bases. But at the same time, we know that it comes with extra communication difficulties, more conflict, and more misunderstanding. We know that right now it's a time whenever we have more ages working together than ever before. So we see that we have upwards of 5 generations working together in the same workplaces, and that's not something that we've really dealt with earlier. At the same time, across the world, but particularly in a lot of Eastern Asia countries, we see that we have a rapidly aging workforce. And so we have more and more older workers than we've had in the past. So we need to have different strategies for this. So a lot of the stereotypes are that older workers at some point uh, are not able to learn or be retrained, right? An old dog can't learn new tricks, as the saying goes. We tend to think of older workers as perhaps more unhealthy, they're more expensive on the payroll, and that they're not willing to really innovate or change in this rapidly changing world. And so this ageism, as we tend to call this type of discrimination, is something that's very much alive. And so we do know that people are still able to learn and grow in their competencies even past the age of 80. So this idea of an inability or an unwillingness to learn is unfounded. And we do find that there's a lot of benefits in the workplace itself. So there's a lot less shrinkage of our inventory. We find that there's a lot more whistleblowing. So we have a lot of moral benefits that happen from having more seasoned workers. And also, we see that there's a lot of benefits in terms of keeping them engaged, right? So we want to make sure that they have goals, they have things that they're excited about that they're going to tackle. We provide them with new and different opportunities and allow opportunities for them to mentor and pass on some of this expertise that they have while also reducing some of the stress and other burdens that they have. So, as long as we're able to do this, there's also other research that shows in an American sample that proactivity is unrelated to age, as long as people have something to look forward to. And in a similar Chinese sample, it was actually found that it was positively correlated with age, so that older workers were actually more proactive at work as long as they had that new goal that they were trying to achieve. All right, so we see a lot of positives associated with the more seasoned workforce, but of course, there are special considerations that we have to think about as leaders. If we find that our older workers are surrounded by young people, or if there's a lot of young cues in the workplace, then sometimes we might experience something called stereotype threat. So it's basically just this reminder that, oh, yes, you belong to this group of older workers. And then you're reminded of all these negative stereotypes of being not innovative or not willing to learn or somehow being slower, right? And so all these cues can kind of conjure these fears in older workers. And it's these fears themselves that start to make people a little bit more demotivated or, in a lot of cases, actually burn out. And burnout among older workers is something that leaders should be especially concerned about for a couple of reasons. So, whenever a younger worker burns out, they just quit and go and get another job, right? They say, okay, forget this one, I'm going to get another one. But we know that it takes people over the age of 50 roughly twice the amount of time to find a new job, right? It's not easy for them to go out and find one. So, they're much more likely, even if they are burned out or disengaged, to stay in that job itself. Right, so they stay on, and so we have workers who typically have a larger salary. So they're expensive workers that are disengaged and only bringing 60 to 70% of their value as a result. Perhaps more importantly, we do know that things like burnout and disengagement are contagious, right? They can spill over into their subordinates and their coworkers. So you can start to have a kind of negative spiral that goes on. So it's really important that we put different kind of policies in place and that we send the message through our leadership that these people are valued and that they bring a specific skill set to the workplace. And there's a lot of different ways that people are doing this. All right, so one thing is to not necessarily keep people on the same career track throughout their whole lives. So always offering these different kind of ways or different kind of positions that are opening to them, so people can try new things over the course of their lifespan, particularly if we're thinking about keeping people 10, 15, 20 years past the traditional retirement ages. As we see that countries in Europe and also in China, that they're starting to push back slightly this retirement age and the pensioning age. So, if we're keeping people engaged in the workforce longer, then we need to offer them new and varied tasks and assignments and opportunities. There's also a lot of really cool things happening in terms of kind of getting people back from retirement. So there's a lot of companies that are bringing this. They have a couple pharmaceutical companies that are doing this. So they target these people who just retired in the last couple years. Then they offer them returnships, which gives them some reskilling. It offers them a phased pathway back, kind of out of retirement to start in part time, and they get these new skills that are able, in many cases, to get turned into full time positions if they want to. Also, we can see that these technological advancements don't have to be a block for our older workers, right? They can actually be a tool to help other people. So the kind of ways that people are doing this, it can be something that's very small. Like for example, in the BMW factories, did a really good example of this, where they made the workbenches in the factories a little bit softer. They installed wooden floors that were easier on people's joints. They increased the font size on monitors. Very, very inexpensive changes, but things that sent the message that you're still valued. We can work around some of these small changes, and we want to see you stick around. All right. Another thing is using technology as kind of a matchmaker for kind of mutual mentoring programs. So, anytime I teach younger students, one of the biggest questions they always ask is, how can I get someone to mentor me, right? How can I convince someone to spend their time and tell me the tricks of their industry? And so, a lot of times, if we have some kind of a matching system to where the younger people can help with the technology side of the workplace, and then the older workers can help impart some of their wisdom that they've accumulated over the course of their career, then it could be a real win-win. All right, so the big issue here is keeping workers engaged and even kind of reimagining the traditional career and retirement trajectory altogether. So typically, the big pushback of this is that the older workers are the ones that are the most expensive. But nowadays, with the fluctuating markets and with people kind of working longer, but sometimes, especially in certain countries, big healthcare expenditures, we find that sometimes people that get to the so-called retirement age, but still need to work, right? So even this financial incentive sometimes doesn't have an expiration date, so to speak. So we see that this is something that we can't assume, but also it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to pay the most experienced workers the most. We should really scope this in to the responsibility that a person has, and the kind of difficulty of the job itself. And a lot of workers might be really content to work back, to scale back their work, to work part time, to have less stress and responsibility, in exchange for having kind of maybe a portion of their salary before. But still, they're able to keep engaged, to keep their minds active, to keep socially in touch with other people, and to stave off some of the boredom and health complaints that we see of people in retirement. So, this is just one aspect of managing across differences. But as a leader, it just reminds we have to sit there and say, okay, what are my actions? What are my policies and practices saying, or what kind of messages are they sending to my employees? And am I sending the message that you're valued and we value this expertise and we're willing to make accommodations and changes? Are you willing to disrupt your ideas of how you lead and the ways that you design jobs in order to accommodate different kinds of people? And I think to the extent that we can do this, then we're going to keep the top talent, regardless of where they are in their life cycle or regardless of what kind of strengths that they bring to the workplace. All right, so this is one trend that I think is important. So, this idea of kind of altering the way we think about work or kind of coming up with different paradigms or ways of working for older workers could also be expanded, and I think should be expanded to the workforce as a whole. So, this is a really great Business Review article that came out last year. So, basically, it's this idea that in the modern era, we can't just assume that the only reason people are at work is for a paycheck, right? The job that people's jobs do for them is more than just giving money for labor, right? Nowadays, people get all kinds of things out of their work. Work for a lot of people, and it's going to be something that's very individual. But for some people, it might be a interesting puzzle to solve. It might be fixing something that's broken. It might be a place where they can socialize and be around their friends and belong and feel as part of a tribe or part of an elite team. What we get out of work differs a little bit, and people have different priorities when it comes to different aspects of this. And so this kind of movement basically says, why do we have these cookie cutter, one size fits all job descriptions and job titles and responsibilities? If so much is being disrupted right now, if so many of the tasks are being automated already, we're already having to redesign and rethink about what jobs humans are going to do. So if we're doing that, and we really want to try and reverse some of this disengagement and mistrust that we're seeing in the modern workforce, why don't we really take this approach and tailor these jobs to the extent possible to people's strengths, to people's preferences, and try and tap into what people find most meaningful and motivating by putting more of that into their jobs and putting more of the rote and meaningless things into something that AI takes over. All right, so it's an interesting way of thinking about personalizing work to people's needs and also strengths. And of course, it can't be about giving every employee exactly what they want. As leaders, we always need to be finding that balance between organizational necessities and priorities and employee preferences. We also need to think about the dynamics between different employees, right? So where we're always balancing this idea of freedom with fairness, right? So there's still work to be done from a leader perspective, but I think that there can be a lot more in rethinking our assumptions about what work has to look like and how much we can actually take these different tasks and personalize it in a way that gets the most out of our human talent and keeps them engaged and at the top level of motivation. So this kind of goes back to these key drivers of humans, and I mentioned before that I don't see many aspects of leadership changing. And what I mean by that is that whenever I, as a leader, am interacting and motivating and leading my employees, the same psychological motivators that we have, I argue, always had, are going to be the same, right? People are driven by the same things. And these are the chance to belong, right? The chance to have these social contacts and to be part of a tribe. To also have some kind of unique value to showcase that you do something special that other people couldn't, right? You bring something special to the table, you showcase your skills and knowledge. It can also be contributing to a bigger cause, right? Being bigger than just yourself, trying to contribute to someone else's life or a bigger purpose. As long as you can find new ways and appropriate ways for your environment to pull on these levers, I think that we can help increase the engagement, loyalty, and performance of the humans that we still have working for us. Okay, so this is a good one. You can kind of go through these different items on your own. But I think if we're doing a really good job of this as leaders, then we'll find that people feel that they are represented in the work that they do. If we have a job that really is tailored to them, to where their strengths can shine and that they can really show what they're contributing to other people and to bigger causes, then the more likely that they're going to answer a lot of these different items in a positive way. So, the ultimate goal as a leader is to try and help employees really feel that they are being the fullest and highest potential version of themselves at work and that they're really contributing their fullest and becoming the highest level of who they could be at work. So I think this should be kind of the end goal, and it's something to kind of aspire to as a leader in the modern age. A third key element of being a leader in this era of flux and technological change, of course, is that all of us are having to have a crash course and sharpen our AI acumen. So, a lot of us are trying to figure out what being a leader in this era of AI means. And so, I think that there are a lot of really good takeaways for what we can do as we see our workplaces really shifting. If you're looking for another resource outside of this talk, I would really recommend this book by David De Kramer, this idea of being an AI savvy leader. And so, a lot of the different messages that we have are that you really need to keep those key interpersonal competencies. You really have to make all these different efforts that we have always had to make in terms of change management, in terms of people management. These do not go away even though we have AI. It's not that all of a sudden AI is going to take over every single human competency and human job that we have. So I think having this in mind is something that's very, very important. Yes, it is different from previous digital changes and transformations that we've had, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that we have to let go of these core things that make us exceptional leaders. So I'll explain a little bit about how to navigate those two realities. So, what we see a lot of leaders doing, maybe they don't have that AI acumen, so they tend to kind of offload or delegate all this rollout of AI changes and adoption to the technical teams. And this is something that is really kind of seen as one of the key failures of a lot of the AI adoption programs that are currently going on. Um, Professor De Kramer estimates that about 87% of these AI adoption programs are actually failing at the moment because people and leaders in particular are not taking the helm at driving these changes and explaining what these changes mean to employees and explaining, most importantly, why we have to make this adoption of this technology. The major thing that we need to do is lead, right? Ask people about how AI could be useful in their jobs. Talk with different customer segments before it's rolled out to manage their expectations and to understand what they want to get out of it. So, inquiry, questioning, listening on a deep level before you actually go into these different processes. And having and communicating the very clear expectation that AIs are not synonymous with humans. Each one has their own strengths and weaknesses, and kind of saying why we're doing the adoption of AI, what it's going to serve, how it aligns with our purpose and our strategy as an organization. But at the same time, what we value about our human talent and what the humans bring to the table that is not replicated by AI. So it takes a lot of communication. It takes a lot of sending these messages through a lot of different forums. And I think that having this and being trustworthy as you do it can be the key between a successful AI adoption and a non successful one. All right. Also, we need to kind of keep in mind when we're setting up our budgets for these programs, don't spend, as most leaders are doing now, 90% of your budget on the technology itself, right? We tend to get a big budget and we want to get the best that money can buy. We don't spend any money or time in reskilling or retraining our human talent to be able to use these tools in a way that helps them to be more productive and frees up time for more innovative pursuits. All right, so there also needs to be a message, and I think this is really important because humans are naturally very afraid and fearful more than any other technology of AI because it is an identity threat to us, right? So, more than any other technology, there's this fear of replacement, there's this fear of diminishing the thing that we bring to the table, our own unique value. That AI is second and humans are first. So, having a very human centric message both in terms of the humans that you're servicing, in terms of your customers and the community, and in terms of your other stakeholders, like your investors and your employees. So we have a lot of research coming out of NUS right now. So Professor Sam Yam is really at the forefront of this in our department. A lot of research of how employees and leaders are learning to work with AI and what are some best practices. So this research study showed a really cool thing that if leaders work with employees to recraft, right, to change or personalize the jobs around AI, then people become a lot more engaged. They're more willing to use the AI tools, and it kind of creates or stops some of this backlash of employees to the technology, and instead it causes them to embrace it, right? And they're actually engaged in more helping behaviors where they share these informal learnings about how to work with the AI with their colleagues. All right. Another thing that's important here is the leader themselves, right? Because Employees naturally mistrust AI and similar technological tools and automation, right? Because of this fear, this threat that it has to our own cognition and our own value as humans. But this is compounded so much more if they also don't trust you as a leader, right? So establishing that baseline of trust firsthand before you go into any of these rollouts is paramount, because if people don't trust you, they're certainly not going to trust whenever you bring in a new AI system. They're not going to trust that you have their best interests at heart, or that you've even thought about what this means for you, for your work, and for your livelihood. Right, so authenticity, trustworthiness as leader, these kind of cornerstone. This is not very new in terms of leadership, but we find that it's even more important. And the research is starting to come out to kind of corroborate this, that making sure that you're setting this, that you're showing your employees that you're benevolent and that you're competent and that you have thought about their interest is even more important to allow people to embrace the AI. Right. And in particular, the study showed that if the leader was shown as just kind of wanting to do the latest trend or wanting to kind of show off or seek to impress by having AI, that this really was seen much more negatively than if they really thought that the leader was being purpose driven, right? That the AI was something that aligned with their vision and mission of what they're trying to accomplish as a company, right? So consistency, authenticity, trustworthiness as leaders, very much paramount in the age of AI. Okay, so some other tips. I mentioned that you have to have this human centric message. And part of this is by being very clear in the distinction of what AI is good at and what humans are good at. Right? And so we know that AI is very good at gathering and crunching, making sense, or identifying patterns in very, very large amounts of data. They also tend to work more quickly than humans can on some rote tasks that don't involve real creativity. So that means a lot more time for improved productivity, efficiency, and time for humans to devote to more innovative pursuits. Humans, in contrast, are good at evaluating these ideas because AI can generate a lot of ideas in a very small amount of time, but it has no way of knowing which ideas are good, which are bad, which are worth pursuing, which are not. This judgment is where humans come into play, and why we still need human, not only leaders but also employees on the other end. We also need employees and leaders on the front end. Humans are much better at asking the right questions. So there's a lot of use cases out there of AI systems that, for example, we're just kind of looking through the customer data and trying to predict which customers were most likely to leave very soon, right? Which ones were looking at had low loyalty scores. But when they reevaluated whether they were asking the right question, it shouldn't just be who is at risk of leaving among our customers, but the question should actually be who can we actually convince to stay with us? So asking the right questions is a uniquely human trait that we need people still to do. And then finally, figuring out which problems need solving, and then also true creativity, right? Not just recombining things, but really coming up with true, new, and disruptive things. These are what we need our humans to be focusing on. And so, keeping these distinction in mind, we need our leaders to have certain attitudes, but also certain behaviors. So, as I mentioned, credibility and trustworthiness is paramount, because if they do not trust you, if you are not being authentic, then they're not going to trust any kind of intervention with AI, and there's going to be even more resistance. But also, building your own AI acumen, not delegating it to the tech people. You need to know at the very basic level, even if you don't understand the inner workings of how the technology functions, you need to know why this is aligned with your strategy, how it's going to help you meet those ultimate goals that you have set for your company, and how it affects each and every one of your stakeholders. So, talking about the why is one of your most important jobs as a leader, right? So, you need to be able to have a story in place to say why this is necessary, not just because everyone else is doing it, not just because it's trendy, but what purpose? How does this serve our mission and our goals of what we're trying to accomplish as a company? So you need to also really make an effort to champion your human talent. Make sure that in this area, whenever we're reaping these rewards of excess productivity, that we are also sharing this and championing it and making sure that we're including humans that remain along the way. So to this extent, especially with all the emotions and with the threat emotion that the humans are going to be facing, you need to put in extra efforts more than you would have before to really kind of showing how much you value the inputs that they're having and to show that your support and your priority is still with them. The one of the ways that you do this is by asking employees, the people who are actually doing the work, to help design how the AI is going to be used. How can we use this tool to make your job better, easier, more efficient? Right? They are the ones that do the work, and so just like going all the way back to the Taylor studies of before, um, it's not about looking from afar and trying to make a guess or a judgment about how we can put AI in. Why not go to the ground floor and start talking to people and ask people to co-create how they're going to work with AI and how it can help them to do their job better? Also, providing ample support and resources, making sure that there are training available so that people aren't as fearful, that they feel confident in the use of being able to employ it. And then always having a human, and this is important, not a chatbot, but a human that people can go to very easily to voice any concerns about the AI decisions that are being made or output that's happening. So you always want to have open channels of communication to where you can get that feedback about how AI is being deployed or some of the output before it becomes a bigger problem. All right, so another thing that you should start to do as part of your role as the chief communicator is not only explain why the AI is necessary, but show that you've thought about how it's going to affect each and every one of your stakeholders. All right, so have a story prepared that you've thought about how this is going to change the way your customers interact with your website or with your process, that you've thought about how this is going to change your employees' day to day lives, and you know how that's going to impact them. So you need to kind of show that you've put the effort to think about the impact that this will have, and that you've perspective took from a lot of different angles, and really communicate that you've have their needs in mind, right? That you are kind of considering their best interests. You also need to kind of show different sample scenarios that are relevant for people's jobs so they can start to envision the way that it would be used and how it might actually help them and make their work go a little bit better. Also, you want to make sure that you prepare your customers before this rollout, and also make sure that you're not letting the machine drive the pace or drive the process of work. Even though we can use the algorithms to help make things a little bit more efficient, you can't assume that people are going to become more machine like. I think that to the extent that you can add some human quirks and preferences into the algorithm itself, you're going to have a lot more better collaboration between AI and humans. So there's a lot of different use cases. So rather than having the algorithm determine when humans can take a break, let the humans decide whenever it is that they feel they need a break. Remain some kind of autonomy in that system. Another thing is about variability. Humans naturally don't work at the same pace 100% of the time, right? Sometimes we work harder, sometimes we work slower, right? This natural variability is part of being human, and it should be worked into the systems that we have. Because sometimes, we have other things going on in our lives, but also this downtime can sometimes help us to be more creative. If we have that time to pause and reflect and take an extended break, sometimes that's whenever we have our aha moments that help us tackle a problem or come up with a new solution. Right. And then finally, with all this saved time, it's important that we really are proactive and strategic about how we redesign the jobs that humans are doing. How can we play to their strengths, both as humans and as individuals? And how can we take that time and repurpose it into creative pursuits, innovative pursuits, things that humans find interesting and meaningful and purpose driven? And so to do this, we have a lot of decades of experience and research telling us how we can foster creativity in our organizations. So put all of these best practices into play and let the employees know that even though you're automating some of their boring and rote tasks, to kind of free up their time, they do have expanded responsibilities, and that you do want to hear these creative, half baked ideas, and that this is what their unique value is and something that you expect from them. And this is kind of a key message, and one that I want to end on is that it's more important than ever as we're getting taken over and all the headlines are dominated by technology that we have to emphasize the humanity. We can only do that if we keep humanity at the forefront of our leadership style and our organizations. And so a lot of this, and I'm going to leverage some of my own research in this kind of section. But basically, it's about this idea of who am I as a human and as an individual. So when we talk about work identity, it's something that all of us kind of think about. And something that can be very meaningful and motivating whenever we feel like we are someone unique and important at work, whether that's because we were a part of an elite team, because we have very good accomplishments, because we bring something unique to the table. Who we are and these stories that we make up are kind of construct about who we are very important. So there's a lot of different examples of this, So chefs who call themselves artists, to kind of talk about their self-worth. Engineers who have very rote and very descriptive jobs, but they might somehow talk about themselves as pioneers or adventurers, right? To kind of give themselves that sense of wonder. There's always the classic story of the NASA janitors during the space race who, when asked what they were doing, they didn't mention cleaning, but instead that they were putting a man on the moon. Right? So these ideas about what we're accomplishing when we do this work, these ideas about who we fundamentally are very, very important to people's self-worth and to people's kind of enjoyment and engagement with the work itself. And so this idea of being able to connect people with that purpose, connect people with the things that they believe that they are, because ultimately we do spend almost, I would argue most of our working hours at work. And so, to the extent that we can construct an identity or a person or a part of ourselves that we're proud of because of the work that we do, can be something that's incredibly motivating. And we have all these great opportunities now to automate the boring parts of our job and to only have time for the things that are meaningful and purpose driven. So, self verification, it's basically this idea of being able to be yourself at work, to showcase your strengths, to get other people to help with the things that you might not be as strong as. This idea of being yourself and to having this part of yourself be reflected in your work is something we call self verification or authentic behaviors. And other work that we've done has really showed that whenever you show both the positive and interestingly even the weaknesses of yourself, right? So you show yourself warts and all, but also the things that you're uniquely good at, other people tend to trust you more at work, right? So if we're talking about kind of building back the barriers and trying to push back on this endemic of distrust and lack of engagement in the workplace, one of the key things that research says is going to go against this is by fostering as leaders the authentic self expression of our employees, right? Championing them for being human, for being individuals, for that unique value that they bring to the workplace. And as a result, that is going to help build trust and social bonds that people find naturally engaging. And then you're going to get the most job performance. You're going to get the most potential out of those employees that you possibly can. And it's not just authenticity for our employees, but we also see great benefits, of course. And in particular, when we're facing certain crises. This is an example. If you go back and look at the Marriott CEO's message to his stakeholders during the pandemic, it's a remarkably authentic and raw and inspiring kind of piece of messagery from a top leader. As a final takeaway, what do we need to look forward to? In some ways, I think we need to look backwards to try and understand what are these lessons, right? We don't want to reinvent the wheel. What do we already know? And what are the dangers of excessive surveillance, micromanagement, and letting machines set the pace and tone of the work that we're doing, taking the subjectivity, taking the creativity and the humanity out of work? We already know the answers to these questions because we've lived it. All right, so then what does that leave for us as leaders? We need to know these different trends that are happening, have game plays and strategic ways of dealing with them, But at the same time, really focusing on these bread and butter things that we've been emphasizing in business schools for the last several decades, right? Emphasizing the trustworthiness, listening, self reflection, perspective taking. Right, these are the key things that we need out of our leaders, and we don't need this, big tribal leader that we saw in the beginning. What we need are people who are humble, people who are approachable, but also competent and able to take decisions. We need this idea that I am know what I'm doing. We're doing this for the right reasons. I've thought this through, but I also don't have all the answers. And I need you as a valued member of this organization, as a human, to help fill in some of those blanks. So I'm here to listen and I'm here to get any ideas that you have. So balancing this idea of authority and approachability is critical for the modern era to come. So, in a lot of ways, we think about the tech acumen, we think about all the strategies and the decisions we have to make. But the number one thing that is getting lost in the wayside, and the thing that I think is most important during this transition, is remembering that our number one job as leaders is to have that empathy, to be in touch with the emotions our employees are experiencing, to make those real human connections. This is exactly where our value is and what we need to put the most of our attention. All right, so this is the end of my talk. We'll open it up for a Q&A at the end, but thank you all for your attention.